I remember that morning clearly. The sky was gray, like it was holding its breath. Snow blanketed the trails, wrapping the tiny village of Plainfield in a cold white sheet. People passed each other with wary glances, because this wasn't the peaceful town it used to be. Something felt off, and it all started with the disappearance of one woman. Bernice Warden, a middle-aged woman, owner of the town's hardware store, was diligent and familiar to everyone. She never went anywhere without telling someone. But on one November morning, her store was open, the lights were on, yet she was gone, without a trace. Her son Frank, a local deputy, was the first to notice something wasn't right. On the cash register sat the last receipt, with a name every townsperson knew, Ed Gein. Frank immediately gathered a team and headed to Ed's house, an old, sagging structure tucked away deep in the woods, far from any neighborhood. Everyone knew Ed was strange, a loner, quiet, always mumbling to himself at the market. But no one could have imagined what they would find once they crossed that old wooden door. Something that defied imagination itself. The house was pitch dark. The stench hit them the moment the police forced the door open. Flashlights swept across peeling walls, scattered furniture, dust-choked counters, and a suffocating presence, as if no life had stirred there in years. A young officer headed toward the shed out back and suddenly screamed. Everyone rushed over. The flashlight beamed onto the ceiling, and then silence. What they saw would haunt them forever. But I won't describe it. Some things are terrifying enough just knowing they exist. As the first pieces of evidence were brought to light, Plainfield turned colder than ever. Not because of the snow, but from the fear that seeped into every home, behind every locked window. Police searched the house more thoroughly. They couldn't believe what they found. Strange, handmade objects, tools and items that didn't seem to be made from anything normal. Clues from missing persons, ghastly fragments that forced them to ask, was this just an eccentric loner? Or a monster hiding in plain sight? While officers tried to keep the horror under wraps, rumors spread like wildfire. The townspeople began to dig through old memories, recalling oddities around Ed, his nighttime mumbling, eerie laughter drifting from his decrepit home, the sudden disappearance of pets near the woods. Police took Ed Gein into custody, and that's when the real nightmare began to unfold. But at that point, the town already knew one thing for sure. The name Ed Gein wasn't a joke anymore. It was a living nightmare, and he'd been living among them for years without anyone realizing it. They often say there's nothing scarier than what hides in the dark.
Their search. They ventured deeper into the house. Each room seemed to swallow the beam of their flashlights whole. The air grew thick with rot, mold, and something worse. A scent that hovered somewhere between raw meat and decaying time. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the officers' pounding hearts and the creak of cautious footsteps on old wooden floors. The living room was no longer a living room. It was a chaotic mess of broken furniture, garbage, stacked newspapers, and strange objects no one could quite explain. A decaying armchair leaned to one side, like no one had sat in it for years. Or perhaps someone had, but not anything you'd still call human. They opened door after door, drawer after drawer, and then it hit them. This wasn't just a house. It was a graveyard turned inside out. In the kitchen they found objects so grotesque no one dared stare too long. A few young officers vomited on the spot, not from weakness, but from a revulsion no human should have to endure. Things that looked like handmade crafts, but not from animal hide. Bowls, lampshades, shapes and textures that awakened a primal dread no one could put into words. When they opened the door to the attic, dust fell like awakened fog. The room upstairs was strangely intact, almost too clean. Then it dawned on them. It was Ed Gein's mother's room. Everything in that room had been meticulously preserved. Not a single speck of dust, no footprints. The bed was made with white sheets, pillows perfectly fluffed, books neatly aligned on the shelf, and Augusta's old robe still hanging in the corner, as if she had just stepped out that very morning. The room didn't match the rest of the house. It was like a shrine, sacred and silent, surrounded by filth and madness, and that made it more terrifying than any other room in the house. When the police returned to the shed out back, the same place Bernice Warden's body was found, they discovered more evidence, enough to connect the final dots. An old notebook, filled with erratic handwriting. Inside were fragmented notes, descriptions of corpses, body shapes, skin tones, freshness. No one understood why Ed needed those records, but one thing was clear. To him, they weren't victims, they were materials. Ed didn't deny anything. When taken to the station, he didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't plead. He spoke calmly, eerily so, as if reading from an old diary, void of emotion. "I just missed my mother," he said, and in that moment, people began to understand. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He was the embodiment of lifelong madness, a man unable to distinguish between life and death, a son who could never let go of his mother's memory and tried to recreate it in the most horrifying way imaginable. Plainfield would never be the same again. Every villager carried a crack in their soul, because this horror didn't happen in some
faraway place. It happened right here, among friends, neighbors, familiar faces. And Ed Gein, with that house, became a nightmare too terrifying to even name. People always ask, are monsters born or are they made? With Ed Gein, the answer seems to lie somewhere in between. Ed was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. But his childhood was shaped in a small town called Plainfield. From a very young age, Ed lived in a suffocating environment where love was twisted by fanaticism and crushing control. Augusta Gein, Ed's mother, was a religious extremist. To her, anything outside the Bible was sinful. She didn't believe in the goodness of the world, especially women. In Augusta's eyes, women, everyone except herself, were the embodiment of temptation, the reason men fall into damnation. And that's exactly what she drilled into the heads of her two sons, Henry and Ed, from the time they could speak. Augusta didn't allow Ed to have friends. No playing with neighbors, no radio, no movies. His life revolved around only two places, home and school. But even at school, Ed was an outcast. He walked hunched over, had a strange voice, and eyes that looked like they didn't belong to this world. Teachers remembered him as a quiet, odd boy who often giggled to himself. One classmate once said, he laughed when he heard someone had died. Not in a mean way, more like death genuinely amused him. The only person Ed ever truly bonded with was his mother. Augusta was God. She was law. She was everything he knew. He worshipped her blindly, obeying like someone hypnotized. She controlled every bite of food, every thought, every dream. Once, after Ed glanced at a neighborhood girl, Augusta made him kneel and pray for 2 hours to cleanse the lust. Ed's father, George Gein, was a violent alcoholic and chronically unemployed. But he wasn't Ed's greatest fear. That role belonged to his mother. She didn't need to beat him. Her gaze alone could crush a child's spirit. When George died of heart failure, Augusta barely flinched. God took him to punish the weak, she said coldly. When Ed's older brother, Henry, started thinking for himself, began to question their mother's teachings, tragedy struck. In 1944, a brush fire broke out near the Gein farm. After the flames were put out, police found Henry's body lying far from the fire. There were no burns, no signs of escape, just a bruise on his head. Ed was the last person to see him alive, but police didn't investigate further. The death was ruled an accident. From that moment on, Ed was utterly alone. It was just him
and his mother. 1 year later, Augusta suffered a beginning of madness. After her burial, Ed sealed off every room she had ever used. He kept everything exactly the same, like a shrine. The house became a closed world where time stopped the moment Augusta drew her last breath. With no one left to control him, Ed slowly drifted into his own world, a world where his mother never really left. And in the shadows of memory, something began to awaken. After Augusta's death, time seemed to stop in that old wooden house. Ed no longer showed up in town as often. Occasionally, he'd appear at the hardware store or the small gas station nearby, pale, silent, then vanish again like a ghost. People just thought he was an odd recluse living out in the middle of nowhere. But no one knew that something had awakened in the shadows of that house. A hunger, not of the body, but of memory. An obsession trying to take physical form. Ed began visiting the cemetery at night, not to mourn his mother's grave, but to dig up women who were already dead. He knew their names, their appearances when they were alive. He read the papers, the obituaries, every day. But Ed wasn't looking for bodies. He was searching for material, fragments of a twisted dream. Each name marked in his notebook was a piece of a bigger picture, one only he could see. He didn't exhume corpses out of violence, but from a warped belief. He thought he could bring his mother back, not in flesh, but in form. He couldn't stand the emptiness she left behind. He refused to accept that she was gone, so he tried to recreate her, piece by piece, from others. In the darkness of that house, Ed quietly stitched together memories. A dress, a glove, a handcrafted mask. To him, it wasn't sin. It was art. It was resurrection. And then he started wearing them, little by little, because only when he slipped into that skin did he feel his mother's embrace again, like the old days. A neighbor once recalled stopping by the farm in broad daylight, only to find Ed wearing something strange, something like a deformed leather cap. When asked about it, he just giggled. Just a costume, for fun. But no one found it funny. The town of Plainfield had no idea that in what seemed like an abandoned home, Ed was living in two worlds. One was a filthy, decaying reality. The other, a delusion where his mother was still watching him, speaking to him, guiding him on how to live and how to continue. As time passed, digging up corpses no longer satisfied him. He needed something fresher, something closer. Rumors of footsteps in the cemetery at night, whispers echoing from the house at dawn. They were brushed off as children's stories. Until a woman went missing, then another, and then Bernice Warden. Violence, no outbursts. But they did not know. Ed's true weapon was a lifelong obsession, and that was far more dangerous than any knife. When brought in for questioning, Ed did not deny a thing. He calmly recounted everything, as if describing his breakfast. "I just wanted to be close to my mother, a little longer," he said. No one could say for sure, was that an excuse or the long-buried cry of a broken child? Plainfield was no longer just a small town in the woods. It became a symbol of neglect, forgotten memories, and a mind that quietly slipped out of reality while everyone looked the other way. And Ed Gein, once a name people laughed at, became a ghost, permanently etched into the nation's psyche. The day Ed Gein was arrested, the town was blanketed in fog, freezing cold. Not a single bird in the sky, It felt as though Plainfield itself was holding its breath as the news spread. The prime suspect was Ed, the reclusive man living alone on the outskirts, in a house no one dared to enter. At first, the police only intended to question him. He was the last customer seen at Bernice Warden's hardware store before she went missing. But after searching Ed's house, what they discovered went far beyond rumors, beyond even the worst nightmares anyone could have imagined. At the station, Ed sat quietly, uncuffed, unresisting. He didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't deny a thing. When an officer asked, "Do you know why you're here?" Ed gave a faint smile and replied, "Because I think someone's missing, right?" The interrogation took place in a small room, dim yellow light casting shadows on his pale face. Ed's eyes weren't panicked. They were empty, as if he were staring straight through the world into some place only he could see. He told them everything, every detail without hesitation. He didn't flinch when recounting the nights he dug up graves, didn't blink while describing how he crafted the items found in his home. "It wasn't murder," he said. "I just borrowed a part of them." To Ed, what he had done wasn't a crime. In his fractured mind, it was a mission to keep his mother alive, even if it was only through twisted fragments, sewn together scraps of skin, or grotesque artifacts made from the dead. Once the story leaked, the media exploded. Ed Gein,
Just some harmless weirdo, were now too afraid to leave their homes. They felt guilt. They hadn't looked closer, hadn't checked in, hadn't paid attention when the signs began to show. Now they asked themselves, if we had cared just a little more, would this have happened? Throughout the entire interrogation, Ed never once showed fear. When asked if he felt any regret, he simply replied, "I miss my mother. That's all I had." That sentence echoed against the glass walls of the room, not like a confession, but like the distant cry of a soul completely lost. At trial, psychiatrists diagnosed Ed with paranoid schizophrenia and severe identity disorder. He was found legally insane and declared unfit to stand trial. He was sent to a high-security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, where, for the rest of his life, he would never again be free and never again be close to mother. But the story didn't end quietly. It opened a new door into the psyche of modern culture, for filmmakers, writers, and the deepest recesses of society's unconscious fear. From that decaying wooden house in Plainfield, a new symbol was born, not merely a murderer, but the embodiment of madness itself, where the line between love and obsession, between grief and guilt, was forever erased. Ed Gein was never executed. He didn't die in a torture chamber. He wasn't forgotten in a lonely prison cell. He died quietly in 1984 at a psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Cause of death, respiratory failure due to cancer. For some, that was a fitting end. For others, it was an unworthy release for a man who turned death into raw material. But regardless of opinion, one truth remains. Ed Gein never truly left the collective nightmare of mankind. After his arrest, Ed's house in Plainfield quickly became a magnet for the morbidly curious. Crowds gathered, hoping to glimpse what was now known as the real-life House of Horrors. People wanted to know what really happened there, and if anything had been left behind. Some claimed they saw flickering lights at night, despite the house being locked up. Others whispered about hearing muttered prayers from inside the empty home. The frenzy around Ed never faded. When the authorities planned to auction off the contents of his home, his pickup truck, personal belongings, even the land itself, the public erupted in outrage.
The night before the auction in 1958, an angry mob set fire to the house. No one was arrested. No one was charged. Ed Gein's house turned to ashes, but his legend still smolders. Hollywood didn't miss its chance. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho with Norman Bates, a man who ran a motel and lived with his mummified mother. In 1974, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre shook the nation, featuring Leatherface, a butcher wearing human skin masks, living with a deranged family in the backwoods. Then came Buffalo.
Bill and the Silence of the Lambs, a killer who sewed dresses from women's skin in hopes of becoming complete. All of them, despite their differences, trace back to the same source, Ed Gein. He wasn't a prolific serial killer. He didn't slaughter dozens, as urban legends claimed, but the way he touched death, lived with it, shaped it, sculpted it into himself, shattered every moral and psychological boundary. And that's what made him more terrifying than any body count. People tried to explain Ed through medicine, psychology, religion, even superstition. But the more they analyzed him, the less sense he made, because Ed didn't kill out of hate, not for pleasure, not for power, manipulation, or revenge. He killed out of love, a love twisted, diseased, and chained to unbearable loneliness. That is what truly chills us. The monster didn't come from the darkness outside. It came from within the mind, the same kind of mind we all share. Today, the land where his house once stood remains abandoned. No one dares to build there. Weeds choke the ground, dead branches claw at the sky like skeletal fingers. Occasionally, people still visit to take photos, film videos, ghost hunt, or simply face the breath of the devil. But they never stay long, because something is still there. Not a ghost, not a demon, but the memory of a place that once held a horror too great to name. Ed Gein is dead, but his legacy lives on in films, books, comics, podcasts, even Halloween festivals. Some dress like Leatherface, some mimic Norman Bates. They laugh, pose, buy movie tickets. But do they know that behind those masks is a true story about a lonely man crushed by a tyrannical mother and slipping into madness when no one reached out a hand? Maybe that's the real horror, because somewhere in another forgotten town, on another isolated farm, there might be another Ed Gein, quietly stitching together the past, trying to resurrect a love long dead, and waiting to step out of the shadows.